And for now, I'm just so pleased to be able to introduce Amelia Moore to the Tufts community. And I'm actually a little surprised that it's taken us this long to host Dr. Moore in the Hope Cunningham series. She's trained in anthropology, but she's an unusually interdisciplinary scholar in the way that a robust environmental studies arguably demands. Moore is currently associate professor in the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. An ethnographer who is deeply attuned to the individuality, life projects, and ambitions of ordinary people, Professor Moore is the author of a highly original book on climate change and the idea of sustainable tourism, 2019's Destination Anthropocene, Science and Tourism in the Bahamas. Indeed, she has been a leading voice on how the planetary changes that come grouped under the term Anthropocene might necessitate new kinds of social sciences work. And on a personal note, as many of you know, I'm also an anthropologist. I frankly kind of look up to Amelia. I think of her as a discipline builder, but also a discipline breaker in the very best of ways. Her work is really unusually collaborative for an ethnographer, which oftentimes tends to kind of work alone. And Dr. Moore really models rare forms of interdisciplinary engagement that I think are direly needed in my own discipline. She publishes in leading natural sciences and social sciences journals, which again is very unusual. And along with Sarah Vaughan and Bridget Gorwashi, she has recently embarked on a series of long overdue attempts to remake what is considered the standard citations and ideas of environmental anthropology, the canon, as it were, towards a field that is more diverse, more plural, more critical, and ultimately more intellectually imaginative. Their 2018 article, Citation Matters, an updated reading list for a progressive environmental anthropology, has likely changed the way that this field is taught across the country. I can minimally say, especially for those who have taken my class, that that piece and some of their more recent work is fundamentally changing my own teaching. And with that note, please join me in welcoming Dr. Moore.
Wow, Alex, thank you so much. That is maybe the best introduction I've ever had to anything. So I'm really glad it was recorded. And I'm glad, and you can hear me okay, and you can see my slides. Fantastic. Well, thanks for everyone for being here. Thanks to everyone for being here and for letting me speak to you this afternoon. I can't believe I haven't spoken at Tufts either, and I can't believe that we haven't had Alex down to URI. So these are all things that can be corrected. So as Alex let you know, I'm an associate professor of marine affairs at the University of Rhode Island, which means that I sit at the crossroads of the marine sciences, the coastal social sciences, and the blue humanities. That's an unusual place to be, but over the years, I've embraced this position as a site for what I call experimental antidisciplinarity. For me, this is a space of reimagination, renewed possibility, and radical relationality. My talk today will begin with a brief discussion of marine science and marine affairs before landing in the Bahamas to describe that island nation, and then recent events there related to coral reef conservation and restoration led by private companies. I'll also mention some recent events in Indonesia to help demonstrate the global scope of the growing coral restoration industry. I want us to think critically about these examples and events, and to consider what might be missing from some of these examples. I'll conclude with an instantiation of what I call coral reparation, a mode of relating with coral that can create spaces of possibility beyond narrow corporate and neo-colonial understandings of reef value. So I want to first talk very briefly about my professional field, marine science and marine affairs, and some of the under-discussed aspects of their formation, because this context shapes the work that I do. Where I live in New England, I guess where many of us might live, we like to equate our love of marine research and ocean sciences with a romanticized vision of a quaint seafaring and maritime fishing culture. Coastal villages, boat building traditions, lots of cod. You're familiar with this. But I would argue that the oceanographic and marine sciences we recognize in the US today have less to do with any simple maritime tradition or affinity with the sea, and a whole lot more to do with the last several hundred years of industrial scale marine resource extraction, genocidal levels of coastal dispossession and racial slavery, the expansion of naval militarism, and other forms of oceanic exploitation. From the colonial era of exploration and discovery, through the creation of global whaling and fishing industries and the exponential development of military technologies in the world wars of the 20th century, the marine sciences owe much of their technological and epistemological development to the forces of imperialism, extraction, and white supremacy. At my university, we remain largely blind to our own role in this consequential history. As a land-grant institution, we have a building called Morrill Hall on our campus. This is a room in Morrill Hall. This is the only picture I have of it. I've taught in this room. It's very beautiful. If we took a poll today, only a small handful of the 20,000 people at the institution would know that this building honors Congressman Morrill of the Morrill Act of 1862, which gave millions of acres of stolen indigenous lands to American universities to subsidize their early endowments. This is the tradition that land and sea grant programs are only just now beginning to discuss openly. In my department in the College of Environment and Life Sciences, we are very much still only beginning to scratch the surface of our regional history. We've been part of the state's marine and coastal policymaking apparatus for 50 years, and yet we have not discussed or taught the dispossession of the Narragansett tribe from our coastlines and waterways. We don't even notice that the Narragansett Reservation in Rhode Island has no coastal land at all, which means we can't begin to grasp that this was an intentional form of genocide. We don't talk or teach about the segregation of coastlines and beaches in our region that utilized economic pressures, privatization, racial covenants, and zoning laws to inexorably exclude people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, from not only owning coastal property, not owning it, but then from even being able to recreationally access the coastline at all. Is it therefore any wonder our ocean and marine science majors remain so disproportionately segregated? And I wonder if any of you listening learned about any aspect of this national history as part of your training in the sciences. I did learn a bit about naval ships and seafaring history in small parts of marine biology and oceanography class textbooks as an undergraduate, but definitely without any reference to anything unpleasant, and certainly without any sense of responsibility or accountability. In fact, I think these references were primarily celebratory. But the age of artificial innocence is past. We must take a hard look at these legacies and our own relationship to them. I'm increasingly aware of these legacies, of the legacies of my chosen field, when I think about where and how I work in the world as a representative of that field, particularly when I am in so-called post-colonial countries like the Bahamas, where these legacies cannot be ignored. The Bahamas is a former British colony and archipelagic nation on the western edge of the subtropical Atlantic. These islands are my favorite vantage point from which to examine life on the third planet from the sun, and I've been working in them in some capacity for 20 years somehow. The Bahama Islands tell us what is happening, not because they are canaries in the coal mine of a dying world, but because they are inventive sites of living, relating, and becoming. But sometimes these stories are hard to discern. That's because Bahamian stories are anti-disciplinary, requiring so much more than isolated understandings of island geology, marine biology, cultural studies, or history alone. We are all familiar with one version of the Bahamas, the corporate branding of the archipelago as a tourism destination for Euro-American travelers. These imaginaries of sun, sand, and sea are known as paradise discourse. Some of you have consumed these sun-drenched imaginaries on your own vacations or in your own travel fantasies. Because you are involved with environmental studies in some way, you're also probably very familiar with the imaginaries of the sun produced within the rhetoric of climate mitigation science. In the Bahamas, the ubiquitous sun has also become an emblem of photovoltaic solar power that can save the island nation from impending sea level rise and fossil-fueled mass destruction. These solar visions are deeply interconnected. Sun, sand, sea mass tourism imaginaries appear to naturally uphold arguments about solar power as a techno-fix for anthropogenic global warming. Some Bahamians say the sun is a renewable energy resource we have in spades. But connections that might at first appear to be common sense, upon inspection, proved to be linked through industries built on neo-colonial and neoliberal foreign investment in the Bahamian economy, an economy that is frequently characterized as in desperate need of development and simultaneously as offering a substantive return on private investment. Both the tourism and renewable energy industries are selling the Bahamian sun. This is the sun you have to buy. The sun has become a branded commodity in international markets for sustainable travel, and all this is operationalized by global experts who consult at the intersection of hospitality and climate change science. This is the colonization of the Caribbean sun that we largely take for granted. Because I am more cognizant than ever of the injustices that have shaped the ecologies we also take for granted, I want to explore how more expansive relational thinking might extend our understanding of ocean life to include conceptions of power and justice. In my head, coastal and marine science hesitantly meshes with Black feminist conceptions of history, power, being, and becoming. I want to help scientists follow scholars like Zakiya Iman Jackson and participate with Black studies in rethinking ontology, our being, our fleshy materiality, and the nature of what exists and what we can claim to know about existence. I want to work across and beyond disciplines to think against colonial modes of aesthetic affective cognition. We can expand our minds to hold new kinds of scientific stories, I think. In the Bahamas, radical relationality might be able to help render tangible the links between radiant subtropical sunlight, the extensive shallow seas of the Caribbean region, the evolution of coral reefs dependent on symbiotic relationships with photosynthetic life forms, the emergence of sand from reef ecosystems that renew and break down coral skeletons over millennia, creating dunes, beaches, and even the limestone substance of the Bahamian islands themselves, islands that were once home to indigenous populations of migrating people, Lucayans, Arawaks, Caribs, who witnessed the arrival of Columbus in 1492 and experienced the subsequent imposed violence of European imperial and colonial seaports and failed plantations, islands that became home to so many members of the African diaspora via strategic and violent kidnapping to uphold the sun, sand, and sea economies of the colonial and the neo-colonial eras, economies that contributed their own small but significant part to what we now understand to be global warming, sea level rise, and mass coral death, leading to the 21st century solutions of renewable energy transition, sustainable tourism, and even coral restoration ventures. That's a lot to hold together, but I think it's all part of the same story. Coral restoration has become increasingly popular in the last decade. The last global coral bleaching event lasted 3 years, from 2014 to 2017, solidifying the plight of the world's coral reefs as a defining problem of the Anthropocene. The catastrophe inspired countless media stories, becoming common knowledge in parts of the world far away from any coastline. Coral restoration has become increasingly popular in the Bahamas. This is assumed by many to be an obvious good, no matter what form it takes, but relational thinking can shine a different light on this trend. I now see most coral restoration ventures as a manifestation of colonial corporate supremacy, but I also see some ventures that might embody potentially liberatory relationships. Here are a few very quick examples of coral restoration as a manifestation of colonial corporate supremacy in both the Bahamas and elsewhere. First, Coralvita. This is a young company on the island of Grand Bahama, founded by 2 graduates of Yale University's Environmental Master's Program, who see themselves as entrepreneurs in the global blue economy. Their business plan is to grow large numbers of microfragmented supercoral, coral adapted to extreme heat conditions, in fields of nursery tanks on the island, and to sell those coral fragments to various clients who want to create coral restoration projects around the region for various reasons. Here's a hasty example from the company website. And this page is called Restoration Solutions on their website, and it shows the kinds of clients and projects they hope will buy their coral: governments and marine managers, damaged reef areas, other restoration organizations, ecotourism operations, corporate clients, and then also concerned citizens and communities. My second example is MSC Cruises Ocean Key. MSC is an international cruise ship company with origins in the Mediterranean that has leased an island from the Bahamian government, formerly the site of an industrial sand mine operation, in order to build a private island cruise ship destination to host cruise travelers from Florida. The island is now located within a marine reserve that has been sponsored by MSC. In addition to tourists, the reserve hosts research partners from the University of Miami and Nova Southeastern who have signed on with MSC to build an on-site coral nursery to develop a coral restoration model to show their paying guests. And this was recently announced as another super coral growing program. A few years ago, I attended a conference in which MSC representatives were considering their involvement in the coral restoration game. At that time, they explained that their company was in the process of designing a new $400 million destination, this one, that they hoped would leave consumers with some idea about the environment. Their site was this private island, and they knew they wanted to enhance the coral reefs that had survived around the island because they wanted this coral to be accessible to their cruise passengers, primarily for snorkelers and beginning divers. They pointed out that their clientele were not avid divers or even avid swimmers, so these had to be easily accessible sites. Initial attempts at relocating some of the island's remaining corals to make way for dredging the cruise ship dock had failed when Hurricane Irma destroyed the transplants, so they knew they needed real expert advice and more resources to make their vision a reality. The representatives were curious about how they might devise their own corporate coral social responsibility strategy to get most of the restoration work done with other private funders. Their questions for the conference attendees were very specific. What would investors get out of participating in restoring coral around their private island? Could other companies put their name on the restored reef? Could the whole process be posted to social media? Would those companies get tax write-offs? What is the return on investment for coral restoration? The representatives felt that other companies would want some kind of financial percentage, not just bragging rights. One of the representatives explained that when she worked for MSC in Haiti, she would get a bonus for not having labor disputes and riots among the employees. But what she wondered out loud was the measure of success for developing a green destination. My third example is Bahamas Resort. Beginning with reef ball deployment right offshore of their New Providence mega resort in 2014, the Bahamas multi-hotel complex has been experimenting with branding coral conservation for several years. Their latest effort appears to be a partnership with the local environmental NGO Brief, in which paying guests of the ultra-luxury Rosewood Hotel can pay a little more to adopt a coral and to make an excursion to snorkel over Brief's underwater sculpture garden. The coral fragments adopted by hotel guests will be grown in Brief's own coral nursery to be outplanted around the sculpture garden over time. Fourth, Indonesia. For several years, I've been working with a private company in partnership with my university and colleagues, both here and in Indonesia, to study how an Indonesian small island community has responded to living in the middle of one of the largest coral restoration sites in the world. The company I worked with that was funding and designing the coral restoration project promoted its efforts as community-based because they hired local islanders to attach coral fragments and install coral restoration units around their island's reef system. But I found that this was essentially a scheme for utilizing local cheap labor, not anything close to a co-productive effort, in that all the expertise and ideas came from the company, and the company accrued all the short-term benefit via public relations and the opportunity to use the island as a test site for expanding its restoration methods elsewhere, most notably to Australia. The last straw for me came in 2021 when the company launched a public relations campaign to promote one of its brands, a cat food company that sources seafood from the region at industrial scales. They spelled the word hope in coral restoration units right offshore of the island whose community my team was assessing. Because it was my responsibility to make sure every household on the island was surveyed regularly about their perceptions and experiences with the restoration project, I know that islanders did not know that this advertisement was taking place. They did not know of the cat food brand. They did not know that they were laboring to spell out a word in English on the seafloor. They did not speak English. And they did not know that the company would launch a multi-million-dollar global ad campaign based on their local marine ecology. The quick examples I just provided here reveal the development of an emergent private coral restoration industry. These examples are not exhaustive, but they are significant because of the publicity, power, and iterative capacity associated with the companies and actors involved. There are many conservation practitioners and coral activists who might wholeheartedly approve of such events as the only way forward in a time of pending extinction. But those people may not understand what is missing from these projects. Most obviously, these projects support the colonial Euro-American fantasy of an elite, mostly white, highly educated, professional class of globally mobile leaders as the saviors of the coral crisis and heroes of the restoration movement. These elite subjects are now bolstered by the rise of the Anthropocene company, a wealthy corporate entity or a recipient of corporate capital with a quote unquote greater purpose that is pioneering nature-saving ventures. In almost all cases, while it may be acknowledged that coral decline adversely affects coastal communities and economies, these projects fail to articulate how mass coral death is experienced every day by the millions of people who live in these communities. The non-Western history of the relationships of life and death between humans and corals, as might be revealed in local life histories, personal and communal stories, generational coastal practices, etc., is irrelevant when it comes to the corporate witnessing of the coral crisis. At the same time, non-Euro-American coral scientists, conservationists, or activists are included in a tokenized and unnamed fashion, if they are included at all, in project public relations. Local communities are often part of the circulating narratives of restoration, but they are clearly the background and visual context of resource-using brown people, often children or fishers, who populate the restoration project imagery. Perhaps less obvious is the way in which Anthropocene companies are narrated as the saviors of the coral crisis, while simultaneously being decentered as having had a substantive hand in the cause of coral death in the first place, in a kind of corporate move to innocence, to follow Tuck and Yang. In all cases, the companies are expected to participate in funding coral restoration as a form of corporate social responsibility. And these are exactly the same companies who would rather be seen as solving rather than causing global climate change and the coral crisis. Marine science is too often complicit in the restoration initiatives and the blind spots I describe. Scientists and their statements are peppered around coral restoration imagery and public media to legitimize corporate efforts. In many cases, the companies fund scientific research projects involving restoration, or researchers are able to apply for grant funding to study private restoration interventions. Many scientific projects, including my own collaborative social project, are currently ongoing in large-scale restoration sites. My concern is not that science is being ignored, but that it is being co-opted to promote the nascent corporate coral restoration industry and what it wants to promote, while any actual scientific conclusions about the efficacy of restoration methodologies are still very much pending. These examples of colonial corporate supremacy, in this case manifested through coral restoration ventures, all rhetorically invoke the need to participate in economies of survival amidst a planetary crisis. They all claim in their public relations materials to be investing in coral for the future of local people and general humanity and the sustainability of the global environment. But these are also all foreign-owned enterprises where they're located. Their corporate leaders are all white and mostly male Euro-Americans, even when they are named or made visible at all, which is also not that often. And they are all for-profit companies, even if they leverage nonprofit organizations to enhance their products. These multinational companies have all very publicly invested in turning coral restoration into a scalable business model that they each claim to be pioneering in these various examples. The relations evidenced in these examples are avaricious, colonizing, and extractive. They flatten or erase local and regional history, politics, and place. We can read them as an extension of fossil-fueled industrial world-making. Sun, sand, and sea brands, super coral as a new biotech product, elite guest excursions, and corporate client choices all work together to keep expanding the blue economy in a world in which most non-commodified tropical coral will probably die soon. Perhaps they will die as soon as 2050. Do you find much hope in these examples? I definitely don't. At this point in my career, I need to move away from tacitly promoting this kind of work when I devote research time and energy in the service of corporate coral restoration projects that do more to promote company brands than they do to substantively prevent coral decline and death. Instead, I want to focus on projects that inspire what I call coral reparation. I've been following the work of a young Bahamian woman and marine conservation activist for many years, Nikita Rolle. Nikita has spent years working on multinational, regional, and national conservation policy development. She's been a small island organizer for the United Nations, as well as an environmental educator in the Bahamas. But after Hurricane Dorian hit the archipelago, eviscerating infrastructure on 2 major islands, resulting in far too many dead and missing persons, Nikita has shifted her life mission to focus on preparing residents of one Bahamian island, Cat Island, to become professional marine scientists under the banner of what she calls ocean love. And when it comes to love, she's thinking explicitly with the late feminist scholar Bell Hooks. On Cat Island, you can still find the remnants of slaveholding plantations in the bush. Some people describe this island as the most Bahamian of all the islands in the country because islanders famously retained their oral storytelling traditions, music, and religious practices that tied them to Old World Africa for many generations. Cat Island is too far from the international airport on New Providence to readily attract mass tourist numbers, and it has no major cruise terminal. And residents do not typically return to this rural island if they pursue higher education because stable economic opportunities are few and far between, primarily involving limited employment in the small-scale tourism industry or commercial fishing. But Nikita sees possibility in this quiet place. Why shouldn't local Cat Islanders become their own experts, fulfilling their own science diving and submarine ecological assessment needs? She says that she wants to foster, from the ground up, a community of ocean guardians who will manage their own marine resources and who will be skilled in marine consultation as a professional trade. Coral restoration is on the list of skills she plans to develop within the Cat Island community. She told me recently about her attempts at building a coral nursery on Cat Island. She knew how to set up a pilot stand of coral trees using an essentially do-it-yourself system that is low budget and involves readily available materials. She put a few coral trees in a decent offshore location, and she hoped she could engage islanders to assist with monitoring and maintenance. But the sheer labor required took her by surprise. Cleaning the trees took many hours a week that she had not budgeted for herself, and checking on the nursery was a daily task. The trees were susceptible to storm and wave action, and changes in ocean temperature could wreak havoc on the fragments. Coral died. Whole trees disappeared. She was physically and emotionally exhausted by the endeavor. She had limited funds to hire more people to support the effort, and her nascent community of ocean guardians wasn't large enough or advanced enough to fully take on all the labor themselves. So she's had to abandon this first attempt at community coral restoration. She told me all this with a big sigh when we last saw one another in person. Perhaps she'll try again in the future when the island has a more established group of local community conservation practitioners. I consider this example of Nikita's failed attempt at small-scale, non-commercial coral restoration in Cat Island to be a glimpse of coral reparation. This is an imperfect process by which marine restoration could potentially anchor emergent and resistant materialities of knowing and being in the Caribbean. Art helps convey the affect or the emotion that is implied in the idea. This is an image of an underwater sculpture, Virtuoso Man, by Bahamian artist Willis E. Tynes, located in the Sir Nicholas Nuttall Undersea Sculpture Garden in New Providence. The piece is meant to remind visitors of the more insightful, wiser, older generation of Bahamians who may sometimes get left behind in technocratic marine conservation imaginaries. And this is a set of sculptures by the Bahamian artist Tamika Galanis. She describes her human coral hybrids as a requiem for the invisible. Both the Africans forced across the Middle Passage, establishing the diaspora, to the Caribbean and present-day Bahamians. What would it mean to bring the message of this kind of creative work into coral science and restoration policy? In her book about Black studies, Dear Science, Catherine McKittrick muses on Black creativity as all at once resistance, critique, method-making, praxis, and a site of neurological and physiological experience. She's talking about art and music, but I've begun to see the Cat Island Ocean Guardians and my friend's plans for homegrown ocean love as a form of explicitly Black creativity with living ecologies. McKittrick argues that one thing Black creative praxis do is illuminate narratives of Black life and humanity, and at the same time, create conditions through which relationality, rebellion, conversation, interdisciplinarity, and disobedience are fostered. She is looking for those people like Nikita who provide intellectual spaces that define Black humanity outside colonial scripts and disrupt disciplined ways of knowing. And she wants to honor these voices as brilliant and intellectual method making. In my read of the events taking place in the shallow seas around Cat Island, there is just that kind of radical potential in coral reparation. Photosynthesizing creatures, both coral and Cat Islanders, might be nurtured together in labor-intensive projects based on non-commodified, non-colonized, non-corporatized ocean love. In the years to come, I plan to engage Nikita and other practitioners in the region to understand how vulnerable projects like these embody the ongoing struggle for sovereignty and autonomy on a changing planet, in direct denial of the allure of colonial corporate supremacy. Such examples of community-grown and centered coral restoration projects are a form of Black ecology. And as such, they are also an ethic, a movement, and a method for making futures that can sustain more of us. Projects like Nikita's might be a form of repair. Right now, such projects are so very hard to build and maintain, and yet I hope we never lose the capacity to imagine the creation of something more. I hope to soon be able to travel to Cat Island to work with Nikita and her Cat Island Conservation Institute to help further articulate what ocean love means in that place at this time. I want to understand more about the past, present, and potential futures of coral relations in the Bahamas so that this message might grow beyond one archipelago to reach more parts of the Caribbean. In the years to come, I hope to visit more small-scale community-originated coral restoration projects in the region to understand how they are designed and imagined, funded, and sustained. Will this highly localized and non-commercialized work of reparation save coral from impending destruction? Perhaps not. But it may be one small step among many towards making amends in ecologies that have been shaped by centuries of extraction and avarice. And rather than buying branded supercoral in markets for corporate greenwashing, we might prefer to make more memories of intimate coral relations to take with us into the future to come. And so I'll conclude with this poem by Derek Walcott. I'll give you a minute to read it yourself. And when you are done, I am done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Give folks a moment to pose questions. Again, you're welcome to raise your hand or post something in the Q&A. Just to get us going, I'll ask perhaps a superficial question, but I introduced you thinking in terms of all of the work you have been doing to push anthropology, not quite realizing the other work you're doing to push marine science in your own discipline. And I guess my simple question is, are these pushes being received in your department, your institution, your field?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's mixed. I think students really want to hear it. Students really want some alternatives to the kind of mono narrative that they get, in the natural sciences about the history of science and about scientific leadership and solutions, stemming only from like certain sources. So I think students are actually compelling me to continue to do this work because, we have to provide scholarship that is meaningful as opposed to just reproducing the incredibly flawed legacies that we inherit. So you know, I think I get a lot of traction with students, with graduate students, especially, who want to think differently in their own projects and think differently about what their own future careers might, you know, be able to look like. In terms of colleagues, it's a mixed bag. It really depends. I have a lot of interest from places like, from certain directorates and program officers, for example, in places like the National Science Foundation. So I've been, you know, recently speaking there, and, you know, working on projects that are sponsored by the National Science Foundation that are more work in this vein. But there's, you know, there's several generations of scientists, particularly in the marine and oceanographic sciences, who are not, who have, you know, were fully inculcated in what I see as, you know, a very supremacist mode of understanding the world and producing knowledge. And they're still learning. I'll be generous and put it that way. They're still learning about whether or not this is something that they can cope with and incorporate into their practice.
So we have some people in person here, so I just figured I'd ask if anybody has any questions.
And while people are going, we have Gary Block. I'm going to allow you to speak, Gary. You should
Hi.
be.
Thank you, Amelia and Alex. That was excellent. I happen to be an avid scuba diver, and I've actually spent some time in the Caribbean on coral restoration projects, which now, of course, I feel horribly guilty about because they were through the Nature Conservancy. So I'm guessing they're quite not as vulgar to you. I'm going to preface my comment by saying my sister is a women's studies major at a university. And so as a white male, I'm always treading lightly when I stick my toe in this water to ask questions. But as an environmentalist and as someone who cares about coral reefs and wants to have more coral reefs and wants to have healthier coral reefs, a part of me says, I don't give a crap who's paying for more coral to be put into the ocean. That ultimately is going to be better for humanity, the fish, the coral, the ecosystem. And so while I understand that the economic realities of this may be that rich companies are more likely to put that money into doing that, I consider that, at least in the current way that we function, to be a reasonable trade-off in my mind for the ultimate goal, which is to make sure we have more coral for longer periods of time. The small projects you talk about, while admirable, are highly unlikely to be getting multi-million-dollar funding to plant coral. So I was wondering if you could address that without making me feel bad like my sister does.
Well, I can't guarantee the latter, but I can definitely address it. Because of course, this is the argument for why corporate social responsibility and coral restoration is necessary. That, you know, private companies have more assets, more capital, more resources than nonprofit organizations or even governments. And so this is, you know, big part. That's, you know, the essential argument for why these things make sense as privatized enterprises.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the ideas and materialities, meaning like the actual ecologies themselves that get made in these ways, have to have such a, what I call or think of it like as a kind of a singular way of thinking about the world, or kind of like a monolithic vision, that, you know, relationships with coral can only look one way, that they only have value when they are economized or commodified in this particular kind of way, and that the only way we can appreciate them is when they are creating value for economic development and growth. And so I agree with you that you know, small scale community-based efforts are probably not going to provide us with or stay anywhere close to, the kind of coral ecologies that we're accustomed to. But I don't think they can be discounted, because they're, like I tried to mention in my conclusion in passing, and this is something that I'm going to, develop further and think a lot more about. But it's, what kinds of relationships and multiple possibilities of relationships with coral do we want if we are to have coral in the future? Like what kinds of intimate connections to coral do we want to have if we get to have coral 100 years from now, 200 years from now? Do we only want one way to relate to coral as a commodity? Or do we want to continue, and I hate to use this word, but like the diverse ways of knowing and being and living with coral that exist? Can we take that with us too? And if we only rely on, my language is severe, but if we only rely on these very neo-colonial modes of basically turning coral into a certain kind of valued commodity, then I think we're going to lose all of that multiplicity of being with coral. And I think that would be as great of a loss as losing coral itself. I hope that addressed your question.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I happen to be a veterinarian as well, so I'm, without being crass, more concerned about the animals on this earth than the people on this earth. So to me, there is value in simply maintaining coral as species, maintaining habitats for fish and other creatures of the sea, and maintaining that ecosystem. So regardless of, to me, what's that quote? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I just don't want to not pursue opportunities to increase habitat and increase coral numbers at the expense of relying solely on these smaller projects that, practically speaking, are much less likely to make a dent in the health of the reef system.
And your argument is common. The last thing I'll say about that is that—
Oh, that was the sister comment. That was the parenthetical. Your foolish white cis male argument is common. I dismiss it out of hand.
Well, I'm not dismissing it.
No, I'm just kidding.
It's prevalent, so it can't be dismissed, can it? But with that argument, you might get habitat, you might get certain species, but you won't get all of the different ways in which coral are home to so many different people. You will lose that.
Agreed. That I agree with. Thank you.
Amelia, we have a bunch of questions coming in, but can I just maybe ask for a clarification, especially as you affiliated with the university, trying to do this work, trying to push marine science in different directions. It seems to me in part, if this is a question about funding and resources, the university itself, like public science, seems to be very sidelined here, right? Is there any, kind of just sidelined so some Yale grads can go and cash in? Is there any hope for you for perhaps international scientific collaboration to bring in some real funding here to perhaps do some of this work?
Well, and this is why I don't give up on organizations like the National Science Foundation. They fund non-commercial research and collaborations, and they are adaptable and they can evolve because they're just, no matter what administration is in office, they have program officers and programs and projects and directorates that maintain, that are consistent despite political changes, and they invite reviewers, review panels. They learn from their review panels slowly, but I think I still hold out hope that the internal transformations happening at places like the National Science Foundation will have the capacity to probably not compete like at the same level as a lot of this corporate capital, but at least a substantial level, in a substantive level. So I don't despair yet.
From Sydney Giacalone, the question is, I'm compelled by how you are positioning Nikita's quote unquote failed project as showing what coral reparations can be. Can you talk about how you are looking at efforts that could be understood as failures as actually demonstrating what success or possibility looks like?
I mean, I think that's a really important point to make. Thank you for making that even more explicitly. But that, oftentimes the right thing fails because it doesn't have enough support. And it's left up to, you and me and her to do it. And we don't have enough time. We don't have enough energy. We don't have enough resources. But what we want to do, or what other people have designed and want to do, and what they imagine is possible, makes all the difference. And so that project didn't work. But what Nikita's vision is, what she would like to see, and what she hopes to develop the time and energy and resources to do, could become a model if given the support it needed. And she's not giving up. But she learned a lot through that failure as well, which is also important.
I'm going to go to Eden Weissman. Are there any ways we can support more local and community-centered coral restoration projects? Are there any places to donate, organizations to look at? What might other forms of collaboration here look like?
Well, you can look up the Cat Island Conservation Institute, also known as CC. That they have a web presence. I think they accept donations, so that that's a plug for Nikita's organization. But if you want to stay local or domestic, I think. Oh yeah, thank you for putting that in the chat. I think it's hard because we don't have a lot of tropical coral in this country where we do in Florida. I mean, those places are, especially the Florida Keys, for example, are not necessarily managed by small community-led organizations. They are national marine preserves and parks and that are managed by the state and federal regulators. And so it's hard to think about those things in the US in a similar way. But I would say I would look at what are the local community organizations? What are the organizations that are designed by and for with communities of color and marginalized communities in mind? I would look there. I would look for projects that you could support there potentially.
Sarah Gomez, live at Tufts.
Thank you, Amelia. This was really a thoughtful and wonderful talk. I had a question about your work with those local communities, in particular the one in Indonesia. Could you speak a little bit about what was it like, what the hopes for the community were in regard to their own local coral ecosystem, and also, of course, their reaction to being kind of tricked by the cat food company?
Well, I want to preface it by, I don't know if they would articulate it as being tricked, because I still don't know if they know about it. So COVID has prevented me from actually being there, or for my colleagues and our partners to be there on the ground to figure this out. And I'm trying to decide if it's worth it to stay with the project long enough to figure that out, or whether I just need to cut and run now. But prior to that, so prior to 2020, in 2019, we just did another major assessment of the small island community, and we found really interesting things. My former student Jessica Vandenberg has published about this, but really interesting things that small communities are not homogenous, and so different members of the community, depending on their political affiliations or depending on their role in the community, had different perceptions and different points of access to the project and received different kinds of benefits or had different kinds of conflicts. So there's a whole ongoing debate within the community about the relevance of the restoration project to their lives and livelihoods and future. And there was a notable subset of people who were concerned that this company, they had heard of the parent company, they had not heard of Shiba cat food because they don't have pet food, but they had heard of this larger parent company. And so they just assumed that this coral restoration project was part of that company's expansion into their island system as part of their kind of corporate ownership of their marine territory. So they just assumed that, well, first they come with the coral restoration and then they'll come with the tourism. And some of us will be able to have jobs in that, but we'll be working for them. And so this is how this company is going to basically come in and own our island system. They don't use that language, but and some of them were fairly convinced that this is definitely what the whole purpose of coral restoration was for. They weren't necessarily of the opinion that that was a bad thing. They were like, well, okay, now we can be like enfolded into an economic market beyond fishing that's probably, that might be more lucrative for us, or might, let's give it a try. Whereas some people were much more opposed to that and saw it as threatening. So that, it was just, and I would love to know now. So I think I'm feeling compelled that, I probably do have to stay close to this project for some time to come, because I think that there's been a big retreat of the company and their representatives with COVID, because people literally haven't been able to travel or be there. And I'm really wondering what if people feel like they've been abandoned by that project, or what the relationship is now. It's endlessly fascinating and bizarre. It has been. I couldn't have predicted at the outset where this project was going to go.
Thank you so much. And actually, Clara next to me has another question, so I'll just pass it over to her.
Hi, thank you so much. This was so interesting. And I just was wondering if you think that there is hope for corporations to use sustainability initiatives like these coral restoration projects to amplify local knowledge and the voices of Indigenous community members, or whether the kind of inherent capitalist and exploitative nature of corporations means that they should really kind of step back here, and this should be a primarily community-based initiative.
Well, these things are definitely not all the same. They're not all one size fits all. I think a company like Coralvita would argue that it has a very different on the ground footprint and impact and relationship to local ecologies and communities than, say, the company in Indonesia I was talking about. Like, they are approaching things very differently. And so to some degree, I think there is definitely the capacity to operate better and differently, and to imagine that you are, as a corporate entity, providing support and resources for the kinds of small scale community driven work. But for these to be, remember, these are nonprofit, these are for-profit organizations, and for them to be able to extract the value that they feel is justificatory of the whole enterprise, they need to be seen as leading it, and they need to be seen as, being able to collect the value that's generated from it in some substantive way that can be shown to be a return on investment. And so I think that's where things get slippery and messy, and that's where I worry that there isn't as much possibility there as we would want to see.
This was a super thought-provoking talk, Amelia. Thank you. It was really wonderful, and I really, really appreciate it. Please join me in thanking Amelia.
Thank you. This was really fun to give, and it's always a great excuse to kind of sit down and see where my thoughts are at the moment, you know, having to give a talk like this. It's like, okay, how do I actually feel today about it? So thank you very much.